On this week's edition of Politicat, we'll take another look at the ASG election scandal, we'll discuss Obama's judicial legacy in the Supreme Court's upcoming vote on immigration policy, and go over the different types of presidential primaries and what exactly those votes mean for the general election. This is Politicat, your political news right now. Good evening and welcome to Politicat. I'm Eric Miller, and tonight I'm joined by political science PhD candidate Matt Lacombe, and later I'll be joined by former NU College Republican President Dominic Burke. Matt, thank you very much for being here tonight.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And we begin tonight with the ASG election scandal. Last night, the ASG Senate ruled that President Cristina Cilento and Vice President Max Vincent will be punished for violating election rules for receiving leaked voting data while the presidential election polls were still open. In a vote of 26-9 with one abstaining, the ASG Senate voted to accept the punishments handed down by the Rules Committee. Both Vincent and Cilento will have to apologize publicly for their violation. However, Cilento will also have to apologize to the heads of the clubs that endorsed her campaign, as well as perform 10 hours of community service. After the verdict, Cilento said she was sorry for her actions and had learned some valuable lessons.
I didn't go to Lauren right away with the information. It was the last half hour. I was incredibly crazed and thinking of other things. So that was something that looking back on, I probably should have done. And when, Lauren approached me asking about the situation, I should have told her the entire situation at first. And those were two mistakes that I made this week that I really regretted and
Cilento says with the scandal behind her, she wants to refocus on fulfilling her campaign promises. And President Obama has had his fair share of interactions with the Supreme Court during his 2 terms. After a series of famous cases which helped rule on the constitutionality of initiatives like the Affordable Care Act, the Supreme Court began hearing the last major case of the Obama era on Monday. The president's lawyers will defend his plan, which will give work permits to up to 4 million immigrants who have been illegally living in the U.S. for years. Matt Lacombe is here sitting next to me. Here to comment on the president's last stab at winning court approval. Now, this case has been highly divided along ideological lines, and many of the conservative justices have questioned Obama's authority to use executive actions to protect undocumented immigrants. So, Matt, how will this case affect President Obama's judicial legacy? What are we looking at?
So there are two possible effects. One is related specifically to immigration. If the case stands, President Obama will have had a substantial impact on immigration policy, and that will be something that will contribute not just to his judicial legacy, but to his policy legacy. If the decision does not stand, then it could harm his sort of overall presidential legacy. But it would depend on how exactly the case is struck down. So there are a number of ways that the court could strike down Obama's order, and only one of those would have lasting effects on the president. And that's sort of the fourth question. There are 4 questions the court's looking at. It's the fourth question that's related to the president's authority to issue orders like this and to have discretion over the implementation of laws passed by Congress. In this case, a law that was passed decades ago that he's now changing the application of. So the answer is a classic academic answer. It depends. But if it stands, it'll certainly contribute to his policy legacy on this issue.
Great. And the legality of this case surrounds the constitutionality of Obama's issuing of an executive order. Now, while predecessors before him have issued significantly more executive orders, Franklin Roosevelt, for instance, who issued 3,021 compared to Obama's 234, critics have consistently attacked the president's use of these orders. In an interview with NBC News earlier this year, Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump said he wouldn't hesitate to issue executive orders, claiming that Obama had led the way with his actions. Now, Matt, do Obama's actions set any sort of judicial precedent for presidents going forward, or is this really just kind of business as usual?
Well, so first, I think when we measure presidential use of executive orders in terms of the sheer number, it can be a bit misleading because not all executive orders are created equal, of course. So some of them have much more substantial policy impacts than others. And so on the one hand, Obama hasn't issued a ton. On the other hand, he has issued some fairly substantial executive orders, and that could set a precedent. Something that's interesting about folks' takes on executive orders is that if they agree with the ends, if they agree with the policy outcome, they tend to not have much of an issue with the means, the executive order. But when they disagree with the outcome, they think it's a tyrannical abuse of executive authority. And I think there are a lot of people who, for better or worse, have cheered Obama's use of executive actions, who are horrified at the thought of Donald Trump acting similarly.
And if we could just conjecture for a minute, what for you would, say in a Trump presidency or a Cruz presidency, what sort of executive actions could we potentially expect from those two?
So, it's hard to say. One thing that's worth noting is that executive actions, one of their weaknesses relative to actual legislation is that just like one president can enact them, another president can take them away. So it's possible that Trump and Cruz could take executive action by sort of eliminating or retracting executive orders made by previous presidents, like President Obama.
Okay, great. And thinking about Obama's impact on the Supreme Court during his 2 terms, Obama has had the opportunity to greatly shape and diversify the court, successfully appointing both Justices Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan. Now, with the death of Antonin Scalia, Obama has had the opportunity to add 1 more justice to the bench. Now, what do you think Obama's judicial legacy will ultimately be with his nominees?
So let's say that this most recent nominee, Merrick Garland, is not confirmed, doesn't even get a hearing. I think Obama will still have a substantial legacy when it comes to appointing nominees. The court currently has 3 women on it, but unless I'm mistaken, Justices Kagan and Sotomayor are only the 2nd and 3rd women to ever be appointed to the court. And that's big, and Justice Sotomayor is among the first non-white justices appointed to the court. So regardless of the outcome in this most recent battle, I think Obama will have a pretty strong legacy, or a pretty notable legacy, when it comes to judicial appointments. The one thing I'd add, though, is somewhat ironically, even though he might have a rather positive legacy in terms of his appointments, he hasn't really fared well at the Supreme Court in terms of outcomes. He's actually won fewer cases in which the government was a plaintiff or a defendant than presidents before him. So could be an interesting contradiction in terms of his legacy.
Very interesting. Matt, thank you very much. And when we come back, we'll have more on Obama's final landmark case as the Supreme Court reaches a verdict. Stick around. We'll be right back.
At Northwestern, we're wildcats in every way.
Go Northwestern, break right through that. With our colors flying, we will cheer you all the go. Go you Northwestern, fight for victory, sweet victory, for the fame of our fair name, and go Northwestern, win that game. Go Cats!
At Northwestern University, we are pioneering innovation and achieving excellence across every imaginable discipline. At Northwestern University, the possibilities are endless.
And welcome back to Politicat. The New York primary was Tuesday, and the results went as expected. Donald Trump won the Republican primary with 60% of the vote, earning him 89 of New York's 95 Republican delegates. The two-way Democratic race was closer, with Hillary Clinton winning 58% of the vote and 139 delegates. Bernie Sanders, her opponent, took away 42% of the vote and 109 delegates. Now, with 21 primaries left, we are more than halfway through the primary season and just 3 months away from the Democratic and Republican primaries, or Republican conventions in July. The American system, each state runs primaries and assigns delegates in its own way. This results in complex strategies for candidates during the primary process. Michelle Beck and Margaret Korn explore the 4 main types of primaries we can expect in the coming months.
Primary elections and caucuses have been used in the American political system as a way of narrowing down the candidates in each political party. When a candidate wins a primary, they receive a certain number of delegates. The candidate who at the end of the primary election round meets the party delegate threshold wins the official nomination.
There are 4 main types of primaries: closed, semi-closed, open, and semi-open, and each state chooses which it will use.
For closed primary states, only registered Democrats and Republicans can cast votes for candidates in the same party. Independent voters are unable to vote. Similar to the closed primaries, semi-closed primaries only allow registered party members to vote in their own party's primary. However, semi-closed primaries allow unaffiliated voters to vote after declaring their party of choice. Other states hold open primaries in which voters can cast their ballots for any party, including the independent party. For states that hold semi-open primaries, voters do not publicly state in which party's primary they will vote. Voters must request a party's ballot when identifying themselves to election officials. From here, states have different policies regarding delegate distribution. Some states, such as Massachusetts and Oklahoma, are proportional states. This means that each candidate wins a proportion of the state's delegates depending on the number of votes received. States such as Texas are considered proportional, but will award the candidate all of the state's delegates if he or she wins over 50% of the vote. Other states such as Florida and Ohio are winner-take-all states. Like the name suggests, the winner for each party receives all of the state's delegates. Separate from primaries, caucuses are local meetings in which registered voters vote for their preferred party candidate. The first and most significant caucus is the Iowa caucus, where Ted Cruz won on the Republican side and Hillary Clinton won on the Democratic side. Michelle Beck, Politicat.
Connecticut, Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Rhode Island will hold their primaries next Tuesday. And joining us now to discuss the primary process is Dominic Burke, former president of the Northwestern College Republicans. Dominic, thank you very much for being here tonight.
Always happy to be here.
Now, Dominic, tell us a little bit about how these different kinds of primaries affect the strategy for a candidate going into the race.
Well, certainly, it very much affects, well, one, your ground game, and two, how you're going to approach the caucus game and the convention game, particularly looking at the Republican side with the real threat of going to a convention. So normally you see in caucus states as opposed to primary states, the caucus states reflecting not who's necessarily the better candidate, but who's more electable in the general election. In this case, you've seen, strangely enough, on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders do better in caucus states, which perhaps is a reflection more on Hillary Clinton's current credibility trouble with the public than it is on electability. It's interesting then on the Republican side, you look in closed primaries, the more conservative candidate would tend to do well, which we've actually seen. Donald Trump has won something about like 5 out of 21 closed primaries that have happened so far. Ted Cruz doing very well in closed primaries.
And what about for a guy like John Kasich, who's sort of coming into this race really late? How does he fare? Does one favor him over another type?
Well, you think in John Kasich is kind of an interesting question, because you look in the open primaries, Trump is getting a lot of the non-traditional conservative voters, voters that might stay home, or voters that maybe aren't as conservative. Some of these voters are people John Kasich would want to target. At the same time, perhaps John Kasich now being heralded by a champion of conservatives who aren't necessarily as far right as Ted Cruz, a closed a closed primary could help him more. Generally, you would see John Kasich do traditionally very well in caucus-type states. Not many left of those for the Republicans.
Okay, fantastic. Dominic, thank you very much. And Treasury Secretary Jacob Lew announced Wednesday that Andrew Jackson's portrait on the $20 bill will be replaced by the likeness of Harriet Tubman, the former slave who saved thousands on the Underground Railroad. The original plan was to replace the portrait of Alexander Hamilton on the $10 bill with Tubman after a nationwide poll last June, but the popularity of the smash rap musical Hamilton sparked widespread support for the founding father. Jackson, who owned slaves and was responsible for the forced relocation of the Cherokee Nation, known as the Trail of Tears, was also a fierce opponent of Hamilton's centralized banking system and also paper money. Tubman is not the only woman whose portrait is going to appear on paper money. Sojourner Truth, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony are among the several women who will be added to the new bills. Those excited for the change are going to have to wait, though. Tubman's portrait isn't expected to appear on the 20 until 2020. And that's all we have for you tonight. Dominic, thank you so much for joining us. And be sure to follow us on Twitter. I'm Eric Miller, and this has been Politicat. Good night.